Since the dawn of history, man has yearned to fly. Yet it was the 20th century that has been witness to the realization of this, one of his oldest dreams. To many in the West who have little concern in aviation, the name Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev means little in comparison with other more celebrated Western pioneers of 20th century aviation. And yet to those who knew and worked with him, and to those who have flown and studied his aircraft from both sides of the Iron Curtain, he's justly regarded as one of the true giants amongst aircraft designers. A man who remained true to his dream of creating advanced aircraft through some of the darkest times in his country's history. Born into a professional family in Pustomazov on the 10th of November 1888, Tupolev's youth coincided with the very beginnings of powered flight. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, together with the Tsar himself, took a direct interest in these early developments in Russian aviation. The first military aviation schools being established at Sevastopol and St. Petersburg in 1909. Just 20 years old, Tupolev won a place at the Moscow Higher Technical School, where he first met Professor Zhukovsky, the father of Russian aviation. Tupolev was later to acknowledge the profound influence this meeting had upon him. However, like those of his Western contemporaries, his early experiments with aerodynamics were to be interrupted by the First World War. With the need to convert the wood and canvas biplanes into fighting machines, improvisation played a large part in the technical developments of the time. And, primitive as these early experiments were, they demonstrated that the aeroplane would play a significant part in the conflict. The demand for aeroplane manufacture and repair shops grew, and the young Tupolev found work in one such company, gaining valuable experience of current aircraft production technology. The Eastern Front, where the horrors of trench warfare were made more terrible by the bitter Russian winters. After 3 long years of resistance, the Russian people and its armies had had enough. Workers in all countries were questioning the justice and need for continuing such a war, and in Russia, that questioning became revolution. On the 28th of June, 1918, Lenin published a decree nationalizing the aircraft factories and called for engineers to re-establish production. Andrei Tupolev was one of those appointed to the task. As the first assistant to Professor Zhukovsky, he established the Central Aero Hydrodynamic Institute in Moscow, and was to remain active in its affairs for over 60 years. Under Zhukovsky, the students of the technical school had been experimenting with monoplane design and exploring aerodynamics with the aid of the advanced wind tunnels designed and constructed by Tupolev. Of his first post-war monoplane design, Tupolev was later to say, "If we had reverted, after all, to a biplane design, it would have meant that we'd learned nothing from our work with Zhukovsky." However, there followed a reconnaissance biplane, the Ant-3, which made some memorable flights over Europe and to Japan. It was the design that was to establish Tupolev's credentials as a world-leading designer. When the Ant-4 completed its maiden flight in February 1926, there was no doubt that the Soviet Union had an aeroplane that compared favorably with the best the West could produce, and the propaganda potential of such an aircraft was immediately evident to the Soviet powers. Tomaszewski, the test pilot and his crew, were feted by the crowds, and the aeroplane became the central player in many morale-boosting missions during the following years, including a dramatic rescue of ice-bound travellers from Franz Josef Land. With their cargo ship crushed and sunk by the pressure of the ice, had it not been for the extraordinary capabilities of Tupolev's aircraft, the passengers and crew would have certainly perished in the cold. As well as bringing fame to Tupolev, the production of these larger airplanes also created the need for larger test facilities. Tupolev's daughter, Juliet, recalls.
In the 1930s, it became necessary to build bigger wind tunnels for the Central Aerodynamic Institute, and my father set out to find a suitable place to build them. He found the place not far from our family's dacha, just 35 kilometers outside Moscow. During those summer months, he would take all the family in the car, grandmother and children included, and search for a site. The site that he chose was eventually named Zhukovsky Town.
Professor Zhukovsky had long argued for the need to develop a dedicated aviation test and research facility. In the end, man will fly not with his hands, but with his brains, he had said. Now, with the construction of the larger wind tunnel, Tupolev could take his design dreams a stage further. But whilst Tupolev was completing his wind tunnels, an expedition was being launched that would catapult another of his heavy monoplane designs onto the world stage. Flying from Rudolph Island, the most northerly point of Russia, Ivan Papanin's expedition reached the North Pole and established the first scientific station there on the 21st of May, 1937. The morale-boosting value of this achievement was not lost on the Soviet leadership. Once again, the expedition members were feted and decorated individually as heroes of the Soviet Union. And once again, the machine that had made the flight possible had been designed by Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev. Designed by Tupolev while the Ant-6 was under test in 1930, the Ant-14 was to be Russia's largest aircraft when it first flew in August of 1931. Initially, it had been difficult to find anyone to underwrite the costs of a prototype, but eventually Pravda, the national newspaper, sponsored its development. Though the design never went into serious production, the one aircraft that was built carried over 40,000 ticketed passengers in 9 years without incident. It was in honor of Maxim Gorky, the eminent writer, that Tupolev conceived one of his most extraordinary aircraft. To celebrate the 40th anniversary of the start of the writer's career, it was decided to create an aircraft of massive proportions. A nationwide appeal for funds raised in excess of £20 million at today's value, a measure of the impact on the popular imagination of Tupolev's big aeroplanes. By April of 1934, the huge aircraft was nearing completion and was rolled out for the first inspection. Designated the Ant-20, the sheer size of Tupolev's new aircraft had no parallel in the world at this time. With 8 engines, over 2,000 gallons of fuel, 3 separate cockpits, and a full complement of 20 crew, it was a completely new step in large aircraft design. As well as being a monument to the life of a great writer, the Maxim Gorky was state-of-the-art in terms of passenger comfort and capacity. But the Ant-20 had another role. Designed as a travelling propaganda machine, it was equipped with its own printing press, radio broadcast equipment, and a complement of propaganda and publicity workers. On the 17th of June 1934, the Maxim Gorky prepared for its maiden flight. There were no precedents for testing such an aircraft, and as they taxied out, the crew well knew that they had only Tupolev's aerodynamic knowledge to guarantee that this machine would fly at all. In fact, the test pilot, Gromov, and the crew were pleasantly surprised by the monster aircraft's ease of handling.
In May of 1935, a demonstration flight of the Maxim Gorky aircraft was planned, and the children of those who worked in the production plant were allowed to go along for the ride. My brother Alusha and I were late and missed the flight, which was lucky for us as it all ended tragically. The Maxim Gorky usually flew with an escort plane. Sadly, on this occasion, the smaller plane struck the Maxim Gorky from below, and both planes crashed to the ground. All the passengers and crew were killed. Our parents were in America at the time, and you can imagine how horrified they were when they heard of the crash. They were sure that my brother and I were on that flight, and it was many hours before they found that we were safe.
There was a wave of grief at the loss of this national symbol, but it was quickly replaced by a determination to build a whole fleet of Ant-20s, and, astonishingly, a call for further donations from the people resulted in a staggering 68 million rubles in subscriptions, around £200 million at today's standards. Apart from a prototype, the planned fleet of 16 aircraft was, however, never constructed, and so it fell to the tried and trusted Ant-6 and its derivatives to be the mainstay of Russia's heavy aeroplane fleet for the immediate future. For Joseph Stalin, the propaganda potential of record-breaking flights had been a useful tool in demonstrating the Soviet Union's world status. Tupolev, in his turn, had risen to a high position within the aviation hierarchy. Conceived in 1930 as a means of gaining the world long-distance record for the Soviet Union, the Ant-25 was designed with large fuel-filled wings and fitted with one of the first ever gyro compasses. Mikhail Gromov, hero of the Maxim Gorky, together with fellow pilot Valery Chkalov, were to be responsible for two extraordinary transpolar flights that still rank amongst the most dramatic trailblazing journeys ever. The first of these flights, over 2 days between the 18th and 20th of June 1937, saw Chkalov and his crew set off from Moscow in an attempt to fly north to the pole, then due south to Vancouver and on to Washington State. The news of the crew's successful landing at Pearson Field captured the imagination of the world, and Chkalov was hailed as the Russian Lindbergh. On the crew's return to Russia, the response was overwhelming. Patriotic songs of aviation were written and inspired the nation. We are born to turn a tale into reality, to conquer space. Our mind has given us steel wings and a strong engine for a heart. The flight of our birds is made higher and higher, and the calm of our frontiers is sensed in each propeller. In July of that year, Gromov flew the same route to the pole and continued down to San Jacinto, California, to achieve a world distance record of over 10,000 kilometers. But even as Stalin decorated his pilots and engineers, his acute suspicion of all around him began to mar their personal success. Little could those aviators have guessed how soon their fame was to be extinguished in a new era of suspicion and terror. Helena Kucharenko's grandfather, Stoneman, was only one of those affected by Stalin's suspicions.
Only 2 or 3 months after that flight, many specialists of the Tupolev Design Bureau were arrested. My grandfather was arrested in this very house, in this flat. The investigators, the NKVD, tried to make him give a false testimony, tried to make him admit that he had betrayed his motherland. It was a terrible time for him and for all those who were detained and held prisoner. But those people who were arrested were special and loved their country more than they loved themselves. And that's why, after 2 years' imprisonment, they were given consent once more to build aircraft in the so-called Sharaga.
Men such as Helena Kucharenko's grandfather, who had been photographed by the world's press, were now sketched secretly by friends in prison. In the space of a year or so, they had aged a decade or more. But for Stalin, a new threat was to make it necessary to reconsider his suppression of Russia's best aviation designer. The decision of Hitler's high command to invade Poland would eventually pitch the modernized might of Germany against a Russian air force still heavily reliant on Tupolev's designs of a decade before. Although aircraft production had continued, the imprisonment of so many leading designers had left the industry without leadership. With the threat of invasion, a new bomber design was needed, but Tupolev was still in prison. Andrei Kandylov, who today is assistant to the director of the Tupolev Aircraft Company, recalls those times.
After Tupolev was arrested, his design bureau effectively ceased to exist. In 1939, he was the authority on heavy aircraft in the Russian aviation industry, And while he was in Lubyanka prison, he did what he could to design his future aircraft in his mind. Tupolev had designed the Ant-40 in the early 1930s and was personally convinced that twin-engine dive bombers could be more effective than larger aeroplanes. But the instructions which he now received from Stalin via the chief of police, Beria, were very different. The fact is that Beria wanted him to build a 4-engine dive bomber. It was impossible to do it, and Tupolev spent a lot of time trying to convince him to accept an aircraft which could actually be built. Tupolev won his argument and was asked to handpick a bureau of designers and engineers to be set to work on the project in Tupolev's own design offices in Moscow, while still remaining officially prisoners of the state. He suggested a 2-engine bomber which would possess the necessary flying characteristics.
One of those chosen was Georgy Cheremykin, today Deputy Chief Designer.
The design bureau was transferred into the building where we are now, and the so-called Bureau 29 was organized here. 2 floors above was the bedroom where the prisoners slept, which was originally designed by Tupolev as a hospitality suite for company guests.
These sketches, made by Georgy Cheremykin's father, were intended as a satirical account to lighten the burden on those required to work for the survival of their motherland, a motherland that had deprived them of their freedom, yet still expected patriotism. The aeroplane produced by the imprisoned design team bears witness to Tupolev's commitment to his dream even in the darkest times. From a team labelled Enemies of the State, subjected to hard labour for a year and working under conditions that would have defeated many, came one of the outstanding Russian aircraft of the Second World War. As the Tu-2 was undergoing its early flight testing, Hitler gave the order to throw a ring of steel around the cities of the Soviet Union. In the confusion of war, Tupolev and his colleagues had no word of the fate of their families. They worked without even knowing whether they were alive or dead. As the German armoured columns rolled into Russia, the race to get the new aeroplane into production was paramount.
Many people have asked why, when he had been imprisoned by the state, was Tupolev prepared to continue designing aircraft? Well, first of all, Tupolev was, and remained all his life, a patriot. Tupolev assembled around him a highly qualified team, and in doing so, he was able to rescue many specialists from the labor camps. One has to appreciate the situation in the Soviet Union at the time. For many of these people, to be chosen for Tupolev's design team was their only hope of survival.
But the Tu-2 spelt survival on a larger scale. Its excellent flying characteristics made it a formidable machine in combat and well loved by the crews who relied upon it. The need to adapt to the cold of the severe winters had long been part of aviation design in Russia. Tupolev's aeroplanes were no strangers to the snows which had defeated the plans of many great generals before. The winter ultimately found the German forces unprepared, and with robust aircraft such as the Stormovik, the Russians pressed home their advantage. Then finally, it was Berlin that was surrounded by a ring of steel. As the victorious soldiers returned home, there was, briefly, time for Tupolev and his colleagues to reflect on their own extraordinary achievements.
А коллектив Андрея Николаевича сумел сделать невозможное.
Well, it was surprising how people could actually work in prison, but the Tupolev team did the impossible.
Отпускать из этой шараги. Им стали возвращать прежние орденские награды.
They all returned to work, but they did not take offense. They loved Russia with all their hearts, and that's why they could work, so that even the Stalin government could not help but appreciate what they had done.
Всем своим сердцем. И поэтому могли работать.
Although they were not rehabilitated until 1956, they were gradually released from prison, the so-called Sharaga.
Выпустивший в 1937 году Чкалова в полет, 2 года проведший в Бутырской тюрьме,
My grandfather, Stoman, got the highest award of that time, the Order of Lenin.
году высшую награду Родины, Орден Ленина. Так они умели работать, так они умели любить свою Родину.
For the crews who flew the Tu-2 in combat, and for the designers who had created it, the aeroplane had meant the difference between life and death. For Vladimir Voul, the Tu-2 was also an introduction to Andrei Tupolev, whose daughter Juliet he later married.
My parents and Julia's parents were arrested in 1937 as enemies of the people. And I only met Andrei Nikolaevich for the first time at his home when he was released on the 27th of June, 1941. In 1941, I began to work as a designer with him, and 30 years later, he appointed me head of the Department of Power Plants, a position I still hold to this day.
Какое интересное время было тогда.
Yes, it was an interesting time, difficult but interesting. Now we remember those times as happy, heroic times, when our lives were full of real deeds, for the sake of which it was worth working and suffering.
As Tupolev sought to plan a way forward for the aviation industry amidst the ruins of a country ravaged by war, a Boeing B-29 on the other side of the world ushered in a new era of aviation. The B-29 had been mainly used in the Pacific War, and several were diverted to Eastern Soviet airfields as a result of fuel shortage or damage and were impounded. It was the ideal opportunity, and the Soviet military were quick to exploit it.
When the Design Bureau returned to Moscow, Andrei Nikolaevich was commissioned to produce the Tu-4, a copy of the B-29.
B-29 под маркой Ту-4. Надо сказать, что эта работа была очень интересной.
It was very interesting work and practically moved our aviation industry from pre-war level to that of 1945, because the Tu-4, that is the B-29, was equal to aircraft produced in the United States and Europe.
он был на уровне 40-41 года.
And at that time, we were more than a little behind. Andrei Nikolaevich created in his design bureau a very strong power plant division, which not only developed their own units, but also closely followed the development of other power units, both in Russia and in the West, in particular those of the B-29.
Самолет Ту-4 показал.
The Tu-4 actually shows the good organizational ability of Andrei Nikolaevich, because in the case of this aircraft, he practically reorganized the aviation industry. He organized everything from scientific and technical research to the production of spare parts, and in 1.5 years, the Tu-4 made its first flight. It was then introduced into series production at the Kazan factory plant, and they built more than 1,000 aircraft.
На Казанском заводе было произведено более 1000 машин.
Which was a large number for an aircraft of this class.
Очень большое количество.
As Tupolev celebrated his 60th birthday, he may well have reflected that his 50th was spent in a fenced compound with a wooden hut for a drawing office. With the flight of the Soviet Union's first jet came a new challenge for Tupolev.
Одним из примеров активного
One example of our active implementation of the advanced technology available was Andrei Nikolaevich's decision to fit the Tu-12, which was a modification of the Tu-2, with one of the best turbojets of the time, the Nene, which was made by Rolls-Royce.
Tupolev's first production jet bomber, the Tu-16, followed in 1952. With Stalin's death and the rise to power of Nikita Khrushchev, Tupolev and his comrades of the Sharaga finally received the full exoneration that they'd long deserved. Tupolev found himself once again in the public eye, this time as an elder statesman of the Soviet aviation industry. He accompanied Khrushchev on several state visits and related some of his anecdotes to his son-in-law.
Он вспоминал иногда разговор Хрущева с Уинстоном Черчиллем, когда они были в Англии.
Andrei Nikolaevich recalled a conversation between himself, Winston Churchill, and Khrushchev, whom he accompanied to Britain in 1956. The Russian General Secretary described his proposed reforms with great enthusiasm to the British Prime Minister. Churchill listened and listened, and finally said, "Reforms are a good thing and should be carried out from time to time. But listen to the advice of an old man. Don't carry out reforms too often."
Не делайте реформы слишком часто у себя в стране.
The Tupolev Design Bureau now turned its attention to the need for a jet airliner. The Tu-104, born of a redesigned Tu-16 with a new fuselage, was intended for the anticipated increase in civil air passengers. For the survivors of the Sharaga, history had come full circle, and they'd returned after nearly 20 years to building a large passenger aircraft. The Tu-134 followed in 1963, designed to cater for civil routes within the Soviet Union. But the Cold War was about to overshadow any hopes of international routes as the two superpowers entered the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The Tu-22 had first flown in 1956 and became a stalwart of Soviet Russia's air defenses. Members of Tupolev's design team recall today how they felt in those days that the fate of their country often rested on their ability to match or outdo the technology of their opponents, and that much of history was actually decided on the drawing boards of men such as Tupolev and fellow designers such as Mikoyan. If the enduring image of Stalin's post-war bomber force was the Tu-4, that of the Cold War must be the Tu-95, designated by NATO as the Bear. The ghostly presence of this great Russian turboprop aircraft has long haunted the skies of Western Europe. First appearing in the mid-1950s, for many years this was a sight known only to the high-altitude interceptor pilots of NATO, whose radar defenses the Bears would regularly probe.
Second move on that IC. It's at a 285 for 119. Target now 8 miles from bomb release line. On 0, target now bearing 290, 2 miles in range.
By utilizing gas turbine engines, driving coarse-pitch propellers, and sweeping the wings at an angle of 35 degrees, Tupolev was able to create a propeller aircraft with a top speed approaching that of a jet.
I think I got in contact at 10 right, level.
At the same time, there appeared the originally designated Tu-88, but generally known as the Tu-16 Badger, another reconnaissance bomber. It, too, was to devote much of its time to penetrating Western airspace. It is seen here operating against Great Britain and its aging AEW Shackletons, guiding their interceptors to their target.
Right, I'm happy to take control when you like. 180, target heading. 03, good contact. We have control. Charlie, flight level 300, heading 180. 03 shadow. Target entering a port turn. 03 shadowing.
The far-sightedness of Tupolev's engineering is once again evident in the fact that the Bear and Badger still serve today in many of the roles for which they were adapted. In 1957, there came a civilian version of the Bear. The Tu-114 retained the extraordinary speed of its military counterpart, and Tupolev was amused by the Americans' disbelief when their jet escort planes confirmed that a turboprop aircraft could cruise at such a speed. From the Tupolev team came the Tu-154, first flown in 1968. But later that same year, one of Tupolev's greatest triumphs was to emerge. East-West rivalry continued as he was asked to design and build a response to the Anglo-French Concorde. Tupolev brought the weight of all his accumulated experience of sub- and supersonic flight to bear in what was to prove a highly competitive and controversial sequel to the Cold War. But this kind of pressure was not new to the veteran of the Sharaga. Construction was supervised by Alexei Tupolev, who had followed Andrei Nikolaevich into the company and was now a chief designer in his own right. Father and son now worked side by side in the race to complete the project in time. As the Tu-144 emerged from the construction shop, its resemblance to Concorde would have been striking to any Western engineers. To some, it was a sign of industrial espionage. To others, a confirmation that similar aerodynamic problems produce similar optimum solutions. Six months later, after one last conference to consider the many new variables that this aircraft presented, a test flight was fixed for the following day, the last day of December 1968. And so, on the eve of a new year and the beginning of his 81st year, Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev found himself on the tarmac, awaiting the dawn of a new era in world aviation, feeling that familiar tension to which even he, as a hardened veteran of so many such occasions, was not immune to. As test pilots Edyard Yelyan and Mikhail Kozlov walked out to the aircraft, more was at stake than simply a milestone in world aviation. It was the winning of a race, and yet another coup in the ongoing technological Cold War. Tupolev had beaten his rivals against all odds. Boeing and Lockheed had pulled out of their SST programs, deeming them too costly, and Great Britain and France were a clear 3 months behind with the Anglo-French Concorde. As the Tu-144 powered its way into the Soviet skies, Tupolev had achieved the ultimate. Within a few minutes, it was clear to the test crew that the performance of Tupolev's latest aeroplane was going to live up to its pedigree. For Tupolev, the occasion must have been one to reflect his own journey in aviation. He had witnessed the entire story of powered flight from its wood and canvas beginnings to this giant machine, and along the way, he'd been responsible for the lives of so many colleagues during times of terror and oppression. As he exchanged congratulations with his colleagues, it may well have been in his mind that, but for a list of names he had hastily written in 1941, many of these men would have perished in Stalin's work camps. In his later years, Tupolev's life gravitated to his country house, where he delighted in his grandchildren, regaling them with stories and verses which he'd learnt in his youth. Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev died on the 22nd of December, 1972. The following year, the crew he loved as friends and comrades were killed at the Paris Air Show, when the showpiece of Soviet aviation crashed.
Ему иногда задавали вопрос, почему он не напишет свою биографию.
Tupolev was frequently asked why he never considered writing an autobiography, as it would be filled with such colourful and fascinating achievements. His usual response was to joke about it, but on one occasion he answered, "I don't write, I do."
Однажды ответил: "Я не пишу, я делаю."
Tupolev lies in the same Moscow cemetery as the supersonic test pilots he was so fond of. A cemetery reserved for heroes of the Soviet Union, where they have statesmen such as Khrushchev for a neighbor, as well as cosmonauts, fellow designers, and pioneers. But the story of Tupolev doesn't end here. In 1981, the collapse of the Soviet Union still 10 years ahead, the Tu-160, codenamed by NATO as Blackjack, appeared. This incredible strategic bomber, capable of Mach 2.2, stretched the capabilities of the Western countermeasure designers to the very limit. But the economics of military aircraft orders in the new Russia are very different. Valentin Klimov leads today's design bureau.
Ситуация сегодня очень сильно изменилась, и продолжение раздельного существования.
The situation today has changed a great deal, and the Design Bureau cannot exist without being linked to each other and to industry and plants capable of serial production.
В сегодняшних условиях мы проводим как бы три вида новой работы, направленных на выживание.
We consider that in today's conditions, there are three main directions on which we should work for the sake of Russian aviation in general. The first is a unification with production plants and the creation of large structures to cater for the full technical cycle of aircraft production and the range of customer and product support services. The second is a broad cooperation in all the projects, including cooperation with Western companies. This broad-based perspective is connected with the Tu-204, which is being produced at the plants at Ulanovsk and Kazan, and with the help of this structure, we are able to produce aircraft of 7 variants within the same class. Our other hope for the future is the Tu-334, which is part of a family of similar aircraft. Those are being built in plants at Kiev, Taganrog, and Samara. That is why I think that the name and the traditions of Tupolev will live on, and we will continue to be involved in high technology projects and in the ongoing development of Russian aviation.
An even stranger page of history is now being written, one that will ensure those traditions live on. Old adversaries now work hand in hand, raising the Tu-144 phoenix-like into a new era of cooperation.
Уважаемые министры, уважаемые строители и создатели авиационной техники.
Esteemed ministers, esteemed designers and builders of aviation technology, on this day of celebration, it seems to me that it is like the days of our youth when this remarkable plane first flew, when aviation was the pride of the whole country, when our work and our profession had universal respect. I am pleased to welcome you all here, all those who were involved with this project, all those who are continuing the development of our aviation industry, and all those who are taking part in this international collaboration.
Всех, кто участвует сегодня в международном сотрудничестве, рад приветствовать всех наших коллег.
I am pleased to welcome all our colleagues from America, from the companies whose names are written now on the fuselage of this aircraft. Permit me to open this presentation, in which we hope to show our flying laboratory and explain the experiments which we shall now be carrying out in order to continue the development of this important and interesting direction of research. Permit me now to present the new Tupolev Tu-144.